All right. So welcome, everybody. My name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. And this is the fourth session in our series, Authentic Community Engagement. Today, we are welcoming a couple of really valued partners. So first, our member is NewSchools Venture Fund. We have Tiffany, Cheng, Nyaggah, who is a partner there. They are both a member of NewSchools Venture Fund and always have a place in my heart because they were one of my first funders when I founded Teach Plus. And we also have beloved communities who I know are beloved by many of our members. We have Rhonda Broussard, who's the founder, and Lesley Rawlings, who is the Director of Capacity Building. And we're going to talk today about the topics of authenticity, efficacy, and equity in virtual community engagement. I think many of you know that the reason that we've been holding this multi-part series is because we heard from so many members that members really care about the topics of equity and racial justice, but they know that they're not doing enough. We know we're not doing enough to move the needle. Funders tend to recognize that there are power dynamics, there are racial dynamics to navigate, and this work is really hard. And so we're going to kind of keep digging in together on it, keep asking questions, keep learning from our partners, and doing the best we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all to help lead our learning today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Celine. It's really quite a pleasure and privilege to be with you all today. And again, my name is Tiffany Cheng Nyaggah, and I am a partner at NewSchools Venture Fund. Really excited to be joined by a couple of fantastic leaders who we have the pleasure of partnering with and working with, as well as funding, Rhonda and Lesley from Beloved. And we're going to shortly hand over this time so that Rhonda and Lesley can share some of their great insights. And I'm along for the ride mostly to share a few insights as well as key lessons that we've learned as funders in this work, as well as just an organization really on a journey, as many of us are. I think we are all on a journey trying to leverage our best skills and talents in pursuit of equity, and what does that really mean internally as an organization. So I'm going to just hand it over to Rhonda and Lesley so that you can put a face to a name, and then I'll walk us through how we're going to spend our time together today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rhonda Broussard, founder and CEO of Beloved Community, and I'm excited to join a part of this conversation. When we started talking with Celine about this, the country's conversation was in a different place. And so we designed something initially that was really focused on our COVID response. Today, we're also going to talk about what I'm starting to call the Minneapolis Revolution response, and how both of those are starting to impact the ways that our community engagement is meaningful.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lesley Rawlings. I'm excited to be here with you. As Tiffany mentioned, I serve as the Director of Capacity Building at Beloved, and so very excited to dive into this work at a moment that is so timely and present for all of us.
All right. So I'm going to walk us through some of the ways we wanted to spend time with y'all today. So we want to, of course, just reference the context and early lessons that we've all been learning, whether as funders, as partners to schools, districts, and funders in this work. And we'll also look at a little bit of what it means to really truly engage a community. And a community can be defined in a lot of different ways. And as you think about your stakeholders, please do keep them in mind as we walk through some of those definitions. We also understand that all of us essentially have had to transition to a virtual space. And so what does that mean in terms of holding values of equity and authenticity as you engage your stakeholders, your coworkers, your colleagues, other partners in a virtual space? How do you ensure that those values are still top of mind as you plan and design and execute against those goals that you have? Rhonda and Lesley have some wonderful tips and practical advice on how to get started. And then we'll also do a little bit of discussion around some of the questions that Beloved typically uses to frame conversations, as well as a little mini equity audit. And then I believe that Celine will close out our time, and we'll make sure to engage you all in some questions. I think we'll certainly encourage you all to just go ahead and drop questions into the chat box, as Lesley has just also written in. So please do go ahead and do that. We plan to engage with you throughout this and look for you all to contribute your voice and what's top of mind for you all, so that we can ensure we're addressing your greatest needs today. So I'm going to hand it over to Rhonda now. Rhonda?
Thank you, Tiffany. Today and always, Beloved Community honors and centers our Black community. What we talk about in our sessions is not just academic jargon or hot topics for partners to think about and discuss. The topics of race, systems of oppression, and marginalization have real life and death consequences for our Black community members. We believe that it's crucial that we continuously interrogate and address the ways that biases, racism, white supremacy, and intersectionality impact your decisions and the ways that your organizations operate. I invite everyone to join me in 30 seconds of silence and reflection in honor of the lives of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Tony McDade, of Nina Pop, of Ahmaud Arbery. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge, in full vulnerability and transparency, I spent the half hour before we logged in today in full tears. However you're showing up on the call, we're here to support that. If I need to step away, I may tag Lesley in a little early. Yes, I'll stop there. Okay, so as we go on though, Tiffany, I wanted to ask you just to give us a little sense of what this means for NewSchools to be thinking about community engagement and authenticity from a funder perspective.
Thanks, Rhonda. And, you know, I truly appreciate the way you have framed this for us, and this beautiful quote from Dr. Howard Fuller, where we have to call out and constantly question, are we doing to communities, or are we actually engaging, inviting, welcoming, and elevating communities as we do the work that we're setting out to do for social change? I think many funders on this call, many colleagues who are in this space, we're all called into this work because we want to create and imagine a different future. And NewSchools hasn't always been where it is today. I think it's very much been a journey for our organization in our 21-year history. I know that there have been different places where we haven't always been as cognizant or perhaps as intentional about the ways we elevate our community leaders. And I'm pleased to say that it's still an ongoing journey. It's not something that we absolutely excel at just yet in all the ways that we want to see, but it is something that we prioritize. And whether it's with our investment opportunities, the ways we engage our venture leaders once we fund them, the work that we're doing with other funders, we're very much thinking about how do we actually invite and sort of usher in community leadership in a really authentic way. And one of the ways that I can think of is just making sure, for example, that we are very clear and explicit about the goals that we have with our investment opportunities. So these are our funding opportunities that are open to a number of leaders who may be thinking about the ideas that they want to pursue. And we actually place in our investment criteria a very high value on, does the person presenting the idea to us, does the leader who is saying, I want to do this, come with lived experience, come with community experience, and an understanding of the needs that they're attempting to solve for and innovate around. And a lot of this is also rooted in the fact that education reform for a long time has been an effort that has been concentrated in the hands of just a few, namely white men who have been a part of driving and designing much of the innovations. And unfortunately, as we know, when we don't have diverse representation in the people who are creating solutions, those solutions are not sustainable. They're not particularly innovative as well. Communities themselves have such assets in terms of what they believe needs to take place in order for their communities to be the thriving centers that everyone who has ever been in community understands it can be. So we make a real point of making sure that across our investment areas, we invest in at least 40% of leaders who are funded are Black or Latino. In our diverse leader strategy, which I lead, that number is actually higher than 80%. And that's by design. And it's something that we feel very, very strongly about, simply because we do want innovations that are going to be sustainable, innovative, and truly impact the students and families that they serve. So that's just a bit about NewSchools. And I appreciate the question, Rhonda. Hopefully that's something that you can sort of take forward and build off of as you continue.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Tiffany. And when often folks ask us, well, give us an example of who's doing this work well, and we'll say, well, here are some lessons you could learn from NewSchools and what their transitions look like. Then the next step, and Hannah, if you'll advance to the next slide, is folks ask, well, then how do we get started, right? Because no one will start exactly where you are. And maybe they can leapfrog over some of your earlier lessons. But what we do at Beloved is we actually ask a lot of questions. There's no one answer. There's no silver bullet to operationalizing your deeply held sustainable culture in your organization. So we start off with offering these 3 questions, particularly for folks on this call to consider. So has your foundation had a conversation as a team about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And that could be one conversation. You could be in 15 years of conversation, but have you started this? 2, who do you see as your primary stakeholders? When you're coming into the conversation today, are you thinking about your trustees? Are you thinking about your grantees? Are you thinking about community partners? Are you thinking more about your staff? And then 3, what do we hope to accomplish as a result of our community engagement? We've made some pretty broad assumptions about what community engagement can do for us long term. But you may have come in today with some different framing needs for how you want community engagement to impact your work. So let's take a couple of minutes for folks to just think about their responses here. You might write them down. We're not going to do a share out, but we do want to have a pause so you can think to yourself, and then we'll go on with the next part of this slide. So take about 30 seconds, and I'll keep narrating while folks are writing this down. So community engagement is a key tenet of inclusion. So the types of conversations your foundation has had around DEI could likely inform your community engagement lens. Depending on how you operate, your different stakeholders may have a different weight for you. And so thinking about the grantees, if you're in a family foundation, your family trustees may be the most important stakeholders. It's okay to name that. If you're engaging in collective impact work with your foundation, you might have a mix for who your primary stakeholders are. It might be a mix of partners and grantees. And then when you're thinking about this 3rd question in reflection, we really hope that you can put out your biggest dream for how community engagement transforms your work. As folks are still in their reflection, Hannah will share a poll that's really focused on question number 2. So that as Lesley and Tiffany and I are talking, we'll have some sense of which primary stakeholders you've brought to center in the conversation today, so we can tailor some of our responses a bit more to the needs that you have. Oh, wonderful. Okay, this is super helpful. So Lesley and I and Tiffany and I will keep in mind, most folks on the call today are thinking about grantees and community partners, how we engage them in our work. Duly noted. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so as we advance, hold on a minute. Before folks start diving into what your strategy is, what are your sample activities, we really advise leaders, again with the questions, to define the role of community engagement for your work. There are no wrong answers, there are only honest answers. You choose your strategy for community engagement is the first step. You then communicate it with your constituents. Second step. The 3rd step is the most important. Then you have to be in action about it. right? Don't proclaim to the world that you're going to start using community-informed, consensus-based model for grant making because it sounds right or another group is doing it when you or your trustees have no intention of implementing something with that level of fidelity. So these three questions: what is your intent? How can you communicate your intent to the constituents? So in this case, your grantees and community partners. And then what are the ways in which you can fulfill the promises that you have communicated so that you can be in integrity with what your expectations are? Okay, and then the next resource on the next slide that we share is a community engagement spectrum. So if you're engaged in collective impact work, you've probably seen the community engagement spectrum before. But what this does is it helps you figure out where on the spectrum you actually want to be, what matters most for your grantees and community members, and how you can get there, right? So the spectrum starts with informing your constituents. At each step along this process, leaders cede a certain amount of power to their target audience. Let me be clear again, you may not be ready to cede power in that way. For some organizations that we work with, their goal is to get really good at informing. And this is the most traditional engagement, right? Unidirectional marketing and messaging. And if that's what their goal is, then we support them in that goal. Consulting is the next step, where you or subcontractors may ask really intentional questions. You're listening, you're learning about lived experiences of your constituents. When you get to involving, you're starting to identify ways that your target audience can be a part of the solutions. When you get to collaborating, some folks call this co-creating, it means that now you're bringing your target audience into the conversation before you've figured out what the next steps are. And they really are designing with you. And then at empowering, your organization is facilitating community to make their own decisions, lead their own work, and your role is often that of funding and administrative support. You may be the convener to set the stage for leaders to lead. And so Tiffany, when you were talking before about some of the shifts that NewSchools made over the years, where do you see yourselves right now on this community engagement spectrum?
Thanks, Rhonda. I think that it's important to just underscore that question you asked at the very beginning of sharing this slide, just this idea of why do we want to engage our communities, our grantees, for what purpose? And getting really clear on that question is vital for determining where do you want to be on this particular spectrum, because I think in some ways, that authenticity around do we actually want to be collaborating, and is that valuable? Will we see that value translate into the actual decisions and programs that we are running? That's a really important question. So it's not necessarily a values sort of laden spectrum, and I just want to sort of underscore that just because of the ways this might be interpreted. And so I think we're actually in different boxes depending on what you're talking about. So certainly when we make grants, we very much are in the empowering stage. We're saying you are all proximate to the communities that you're serving, that we want to be a part of collaborating with you on that. And so when we're making those funds, the grants, we're saying this is a Gen Ops grant. We're not dictating how this work goes. We actually believe that you are best poised to decide how those funds are utilized, how your programs are designed. We will be a thought partner to you. But essentially, we're very much in that empowering stage when it comes to grant making. And I suspect that many funders on this call share that value as well. When it comes to things like our funding strategy, our overall organizational strategy in terms of where we are at NewSchools, we're looking at a 3-year strategy that will launch in 2021. So we're currently actually in a very open state. And I think the events that have been happening in this moment across our country with the push for racial equity have actually come at an opportune time for us, where I think that our leadership team, our board, is really grappling with what it means to be about racial justice. And I think that is a new way of talking about the work very explicitly. I think we've always been about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but when you say that, for example, the funder is about racial justice, there are a lot of decisions and subsequent actions that the entire team and others, our partners, will hold us accountable for. And so we released a statement just about, I would say, 10 days ago, saying all of these very important things as an organization. And so internally right now, we are consulting legacy ventures, people who are very proximate to the work, to find sort of new ways of thinking about this that might inform how our strategy will look going into 2021. Might we add a new investment area dedicated to racial justice? Might we think about how our current investment strategy areas, how might those change or evolve to account for some of the things that we are seeing in terms of systemic inequity, which we've always wrestled with, but we want to be even more targeted around. So I think we're absolutely in that consulting stage, and we want to absolutely hear the feedback on solutions that we might pursue and the decisions that we might make. Internally, we also provide a number of supports around management assistance. And so once we bring in grantees, we create convenings that essentially create a community of practice for the venture leaders that are able to come together. And it's a time of learning, of inspiration, of community. And we've toggled between both involving and collaborating on the design of those events. We always want to be super responsive to feedback because we create those convenings solely for the purpose of our grantees. At the same time, we've also experimented with what it would look like for our grantees to drive the design and creation. We've had some mixed results with that, but at the same time, it was worth trying for us to see what it would look like to co-create that space together. And I'm still pushing on our team to see if there are ways to do that without it being a burden to our grantees. And so there's just lots of different ways that we see ourselves on this spectrum. And I would encourage funders on this call to just think about the various pieces of work that you and your team are advancing and where it might make most sense given the purpose of why you're engaging your community in the first place.
Thank you, Tiffany. On the next slide, we'll show some sample activities that happen along each space of the spectrum. And like folks have noted in the chat, the team will send out all the slides later, but this is a high-level way just for you to see, okay, which of our current activities fall in which buckets. And Tiffany, I really appreciated your framing, not just in how NewSchools is balancing consulting and involving, and even some spaces collaborating or co-creating, but taking stock of what works for which constituents matters, right? A frequent question that we get is whether or not you have to do all of the same community engagement activities for all of your constituents. The easy answer, no, you do not, right? So what may be true for you is that consulting with legacy ventures is the right space for legacy ventures. You might be doing something really different with your family trustees, or you might be doing something really different with your current ventures. So think about who your target audience is. Again, we said today is primarily for grantees and community partners, but know that when you bring this conversation back to your team, you may start to create like a decision tree that says, where do we want to fall along the spectrum for which of the different members of our community? Okay, so now we have time for another pause for reflection. Hannah's going to drop a poll in for us to reflect on this first question. So where do you see your org currently on the community engagement spectrum? Are you at informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, or empowering? And while folks are filling that out, we'll spend some time thinking about the second question, which is part of what our conversation is today, is for where you aspire to be, what steps do you think you'll need to take the next level of engagement?
Rhonda, while we wait for some of those poll results to come in, Hannah, do let us know when you're able to share those results with us. I'm struck by this second question about the aspirational, and I think that's much of what has probably drawn a number of people into this meeting today, to really think about how to get started. And there's probably a lot to think about, especially for anyone here on this call who's part of a small foundation. Perhaps you are maybe a solo program officer, or perhaps you're working with a very small team, and then others that might be working across larger teams. Regardless of that, I wonder if some folks on this call might be feeling overwhelmed with where to get started, and curious if there are some bite-sized ways for them to think about next steps.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to hand things over to Lesley, and she can talk us through what some of those bite-sized engagements might look like. And then time permitting, we may also then get a chance to talk about how you could transition your pre-COVID engagement into a virtual space.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Oh, we have results. Exciting.
Ooh,
So a lot of folks are in consulting.
I believe it. I think we're in
Okay.
consulting, honestly. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your reflections with us. Okay.
So if we take a look at the next slide and start to give some thought to what are some ways that we can start moving forward as we think about getting deeper into our community engagement work and moving along that spectrum. A couple of things I want to frame before we get into these tips. The first is that community engagement typically takes some time to do deeply and authentically, right? Community engagement is really relationship building. It is deeply getting to know your stakeholders and thinking about how you have opportunity to elevate and empower their voice in the work that you are doing, right? And even though Rhonda will dive deeply into what it looks like to do that in a virtual space, you want to be thoughtful about the fact that now that we are not able to be as in person and in contact with one another as we normally would be, there has to be an even heightened level of intentionality around that relationship building and around those engagement activities. So you want to be thinking about how do we think even above and beyond what our normal activities have been to how we can be even more explicit in our efforts to invite the voice of others, particularly those that may ordinarily be pushed to the margins, either in our organizations, in our work, or in our broader communities, to ensure that they're present at the table. We have folks that come to us and want to be thoughtful about how they can engage their community, and they often want to do it on things that they have a very short turnaround time on. So we think about folks who come to us for support around strategic planning and say, I am a foundation, we're doing a strategic plan, and I really want to make sure community voice is present. And I need to be done with my plan in the next 3 months, and I have not started any conversations with the community, right? And it puts it in a difficult place because it's really hard to build the trust with the community that, in fact, the voice that you're seeking is going to be deeply cared for and embedded, and that it's not kind of just for show. So we always encourage folks to think about these bite-sized steps because these are things that you can start doing right now, no matter where you want to be on that spectrum, that can empower and support you to get to that empowering end of the spectrum later on down the line, if that's where you're seeking to go. The steps you're taking now will seed the deep relationships that you may need to have to get to that empowering place. So we pop to the next slide. These concepts are consistent when Rhonda talked about that spectrum. That applies no matter what set of stakeholders you're working with. So these same principles show up whether you're thinking about engaging your team internally, whether you're thinking about engaging your grantees and your community members, or whether you're thinking about engaging your broader city and community as a whole. So a couple of things that you can start thinking about doing. First is thinking about how you're really able to center belongingness and belongingness measures in the ways that you are surveying and getting feedback from your staff. A lot of times folks are doing annual staff surveys, but they're not really including questions that get at whether or not folks feel authentic inclusion and belongingness in their organization. We got a lot of folks who ask us kind of what's the difference between inclusion and belongingness. And we talk about belongingness as really thinking about what it means to co-create space together, right? So not just you have a space that I'm getting entree into, but what does it mean for us to collectively, as a unit and in relationship with one another as a team, determine what space is healthiest for us and what it looks like. And it's really important to be even just assessing whether or not your team members are actually feeling that sense of co-created space. And that can easily be done by just adding a couple of questions in your existing staff survey or using the Gallup survey, which has some belongingness indicators on there to get that sense. I also want to elevate here this opportunity to think about what inclusive decision-making protocols look like in your organization. And this really will highlight what Rhonda first talked about around the importance of being explicit about what is the level of engagement that we are inviting in this moment, right? And we understand that may shift depending upon what body of work we're talking about, depending upon what initiative we're talking about. You have grantees who you may be funding schools that are starting to get into conversation about what return and reopening scenarios look like this fall, right? They're thinking about what it looks like to engage families, but there's some pieces of that are going to be like public health decisions, right? Some parts of that decision making are going to be, we're going to follow some public health guidance, and then based upon that, then we'll engage around what it looks like to do virtual classrooms or what it looks like to come in person. So it's okay if there's some pieces that are not that are truly just informing, that are not yet open to receiving feedback to guide your decision, because you're thinking about safety measures, you're thinking about some decisions that are, you know, some folks have donor advised funds where those dollars are going to be pre-directed before they even come to you. So it's okay, but when you have a clear protocol, then folks have transparency on the front end of the process of where their voice comes in, and understand early on, here is the level of influence that I can have in this conversation, and I know that, and we are all in agreement around that before we start to navigate a conversation and a dialogue. And then lastly here, I would just say upward feedback loops always add value. Think about what are the ways that you are ensuring that you're getting insight and giving voice to folks at every level of your organization, right? So I wanted to ask, who do you think of as your stakeholders? Are you thinking about your trustees? Are you thinking about it as your leadership team? Are you thinking about it as your program officers? Are you thinking of your other support staff that do the work in concert with you? And how do you ensure that every one of those voices gets to be carried forward and has a platform to be included? When we think about grantees, one of the things that I wanted to highlight for you all, particularly as you think about what it looks like in this virtual world, Rhonda and I were talking recently about how we had a funder who set up some opportunities to engage with us right when COVID-19 started to take hold. We were all kind of going into quarantine around the nation and really realizing that this was going to be something that was going to significantly impact us. And they took the time to reach out and just say, how are you? This conversation is not about your metrics or your deliverables. This conversation is just a check-in to see how you are doing and if there's anything that I can do to support you in this moment. Those are the only two agenda items for that call. That is part of the type of interaction that builds authentic and deep relationships with grantees and with your community partners, right? Especially in a time when, like I said, we're apart. You may not be able to have your annual convenings with folks. You may not be able to sit and have lunch with your grantee or pop into their school or into some session that they're facilitating. Just doing something as simple as that sort of a check-in and really thinking about what it means to stand in true partnership with them during a difficult moment and not just as an accountability partner can be really, really powerful. Other things to consider is really thinking about what it looks like to create a listening tour so that you're getting some, again, feedback from your grantees around how your practices are impacting them. We often have funders that come to us and want support around how they can diversify their portfolio. And one of the things that we talk to them about is what are the different steps along the way of getting to diverse portfolio? And in particular, there is an application step that thinks about what could be the barriers to grantees even being able to apply to your fund and to be able to start that process of being in a relationship with you. And a lot of times those are hard to see when you're already on this side of the table, but being able to engage your existing grantees and folks that are a little bit closer to the work will give you some insight into what could be stopping folks from advancing in this process, what could be filtering folks out of the process before they get even to the point of being considered for selection. And then thinking about having some sort of a community component to grant reviews can be helpful as well. We worked with a partner that specifically was intentional about creating a committee of individuals that were reflective of the community that they seek to serve, that had voice in who received final grants and awards. You know, that may be right for some folks, it may not be right for others, but it's a way to think about how do you ensure that there is voice at the table beyond yours, and to really engage those that you serve. And then lastly, I'll just say, when you think about your external audience, there's an opportunity to think about how you can elevate the voices of community members that are ultimately who will be impacted by all of your decisions and all of your grant dollars. When I think about how this looks, I'm centered in Memphis, and so we have an organization here called Whole Child Strategies. I'll drop them into the chat for you. So this is an organization that says, we want to fund transformational change in schools. We believe that happens when schools are deeply connected to the broader community around them. And we think there are some strategic points of connection that impact the lives of young people. Let's identify schools, empower schools to be able to come together with their broader community and propose to us what are the strategies that they would like to see implemented that they think will support the academic outcomes of their young people, right? And these are all thinking about what are the type of wraparound services that young people might need. And then they say, based upon that, we don't come in and say, it has to look this way or that way. We say, we trust you as a community that this is what your community needs and that you have the expertise necessary to inform that. We're going to provide you with project management resources and funds to be able to execute on bringing it to life. So they really are deeply at that empowering end of the spectrum of saying, we will allow you to raise your voice up and call out what you know is most needed for your young people who live and are part of the community you serve every day, and we'll provide you the resources to bring that to bear, right? That's an example of what some of the empowering of your external audience could look like. And you really have a whole set of agendas that we're setting around what we want to fund, what we want to advocate for, really thinking about how that shows up either in your advocacy dollars and investments, how student voice, parent voice, teacher voice are elevated to drive those agendas, as well as in your human capital and school seat strategies as well. Who is at the table, and how do you create a platform for the folks who are closest to the work to be able to advance and set the agenda, and then how do you authentically honor it? Right? How do you authentically say, we know what is critical to you, we know what you're hearing, and will we honor and elevate that even if it is in contrast to some other funding agendas that we may have, which shows up a lot in our advocacy work as well. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Rhonda to talk a little bit about what are some ways that this shows up in particular in this virtual world.
Thanks, Lesley. So like I mentioned, some of you on the call may already have some pretty clearly established community engagement that you were doing pre-COVID. And as you're transitioning into this extended COVID experience, are trying to figure out how do you transition your warm, people-centered culture into a virtual space. And I will also shout out Tiffany's team at NewSchools, the Diverse Leaders team. It is one of the warmest virtual communities that I've experienced during COVID. And it really makes a difference, right? We log on to calls with them and there's always music to set the mood, and it changes my entire energy. And I thank them for being so thoughtful about how they engage with us as grantees. So first up is something that we did early on in this call today, is just honoring emotions during times of crises. And we're experiencing multiple crises now. You may have team members or community partners who are really struggling with caring for their family today, or worried about their own health today, or worried about police brutality today. And so naming it and making space for people to show up as their full selves. Think about what are the events that you're hosting online, which are public and which are private. Are you having open forums where anyone can join, or are you creating some really targeted community conversations and inviting specific people to join into that online space. We can't emphasize this enough, preparing as the host, right, and listing people to really take on all the different roles. On our small team, usually there are 3 of us to make any Zoom facilitation work with the same culture that we're used to doing in person. And so just think about how do you start to staff, how you might staff differently. Let's lecture, more engagement. We do lots of breakouts if that was appropriate, polls, GIFs, make it easier for folks to identify with the content you're presenting and not always have to rely on the auditory processing. And then use some digital signals and prompts. You might be, like we use polls today, you might also use the hand raising feature or something else that just gives people ways that are not necessarily having the out loud conversation, ways to communicate with you where they are. The next slide, we go through a few more recommendations. Here, thinking about timing, especially if you're thinking about it for your grantees or community members, is this the right time for us to be having this conversation? We've had another funder, the Community of Practice, where we had a pre-scheduled group of sessions that we were supposed to be having that were planned during a COVID response. And then now, following the protest for George Floyd's killing, we've suspended those planned webinars, right? The funder said, in consultation with different grantees, this doesn't feel like the right time. It's okay to ask that question. It's okay to make changes to what was a pre-designed program. Getting some sense of what access folks have. We often assume in digital space, and even for those of us who are on the employee side, that everyone has the same access to technology and the same dedicated space and time to participate. So you just might want to find out from your grantees which of them can really engage with you in this digital way and which of them need other supports to do it. For example, there's a group that we work with in Seattle where 1/3 of their team works in the office and the other 2/3 of their team work in a shop and don't have laptops. It's not a part of their daily routine. And so we really do have to do their virtual engagement very differently in order to be thoughtful and mindful of how those team members, how much scaffolding those team members need to really access and engage in this online setting. Scheduling some time just to check in, right? Like you're used to having maybe coffee, like Lesley mentioned, you might be having a breakfast with someone or a tea time. Make some space in your virtual calendar for those informal conversations to still happen. On our team, we call it Appy Hour. I think every couple of weeks, folks make appetizers at home and we spend some time just chatting. It matters for your grantees. It matters for community members if they still have a way to engage with you that's not directly about program, directly about individual needs, that they still feel a part of their community. And then the last point that I'll talk about here before we go into resources is just making sure that folks don't feel like they're out of sight, out of mind. Building in ways to praise and shout out community members in all of your virtual spaces. So that might be on Slack, it might be on your social media accounts, it might be right in the Zoom meeting. So we did this in one of our, I think this is my first Zoom meeting back during COVID after a medical leave, and the team had made little signs that were a part of their Zoom screen. Think about what are creative ways that you can use to make sure folks still feel like they're connected. And I would also say, I don't think this is on the slide, but I would also say not to underestimate the use of the regular phone. Or if you work with international communities, the use of WhatsApp, because the regular phone still works. Right? We may not be able to get everyone onto a Zoom call, but we can still have conversations with folks. And in our international communities and migrant and immigrant communities, oftentimes the WhatsApp thread, the WhatsApp chat is a more effective way to reach everyone for some group information and connection than going straight to a Zoom or other video conference. Okay, so we're going to wrap up today with just tons more resources. And I'm dropping the live links to these in the chat also. What we find when we're helping folks think through their next steps is everyone's looking for samples and guidance. And so I think we've even added a few more added a few more to the list today if you want to click through these. So there's sample guidance on community engagement. That's at the top of your list here. I think that is a document from Beloved. We've also added in Equity Meets Design. Recently authored a piece on your organizational pause. If you're choosing to make a pause for equity, how do you think about that? How might you design some of the listening tours? How might you design a brave space conversation for your team? How might you make space for your internal community to reset? Lesley mentioned earlier when we talked about internal team, adding belongingness indicators. We dropped in the link here to Gallup Q12's employee engagement questionnaire, some other racial equity tools on community engagement from Living Cities, the ladder of citizen participation. And Tiffany was sharing. Tiffany, do you want to talk us through the NewSchools guidance?
Sure. You know, we're fairly new to this space. I don't think that this was our wheelhouse ever. We've never really done a ton of virtual engagement because we value that in-person contact, relationship building so much. And I actually think it's the first link that you dropped in the chat box, so folks have that. And when, you know, shelter in place first started here in the Bay Area where we're based, you know, in early March, we realized this was definitely going to upend quite a number of our plans. And so we started talking to some partners in the field. We attended a bunch of webinars. We also just reached out to folks like you, Rhonda, who have already been in, you know, the virtual space. Some of our grantees design their work as asynchronous learning opportunities that are also online. And so we sort of cobbled together some of those best practices into one document that we hope will be helpful to you all. We had a bit of a slant on it in terms of making sure that this was about, you know, the virtual community meetings that might be happening, that might be a place for learning. But I imagine that many of the virtual meetings that funders and colleagues are organizing on this call have many of the same objectives in mind. So we hope that that's useful to you all.
Thank you, thank you. Celine, I think we are wrapped up. I don't know if there's usually time for questions.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So number one, thank you. This was super informative, and I think just an incredibly important framework for people as they think through how to do this better. I wanted to invite, we have time for a few questions if people want to either throw themselves off of mute or throw them in the chat box. We did have a really interesting conversation, I think, within the chat box about this question of, you know, this is a very complicated time, especially with COVID-19, especially with the pressures on funders to support basic needs and getting food and shelter and those types of concerns to such a vast number of Americans, that this question of, you know, I'm a newer grantee and I am in a financially precarious position, and yet I feel like if I say that to my grant maker, I'm more at risk. Any advice in navigating that? I think that's a real central challenge of this moment.
I would agree, and I think that's even compounded for leaders of color. And we talk about this often in Tiffany's portfolio, what it looks like to ask for help. And I will say, as someone who grew up in relative poverty, to say I don't have enough and I need more feels like it's little Rhonda, 7 years old, all over again. There's no way I'm going to tell my funder that we're struggling. And which is why in some of the advice that Lesley gave, the funder outreach is really important in this space, because you may see it across your portfolios where you have some grantees who are very confident in asking for more, who are very confident and in constant communication with you about their needs, and others who will never reach out. And so thinking about a more equitable response says, hey, we're doing a quick touch base with everyone to ask these same questions. Some folks who are able to do more funding have done that, but one of our partners at Elma Philanthropies, they knew during COVID, during the first phase of COVID, that they couldn't do rapid response funds. And so when they called and made the offer of help and support, they were just able to say, this is how we can support you. So we can provide you with more technical assistance. We can help do more communications. We can help get you connected with other resources in your country. And do you want any of these services?
Another question that I have, I know you all do work in creating brave spaces, and you kind of touched on that notion, but didn't go deep. And so I would ask, whose responsibility is it? How does that fit into the spectrum of engagement? And, you know, do you need a facilitator? You know, how to do this well? This is a really difficult question, and I think something that people are thinking about right now.
Yeah, so I think that when we advise folks around hosting a brave space, we take a couple of lenses. The first is that it is very common in folks' tendency to want to lead into their BIPOC staff, their Black, Indigenous, people of color staff, to be the leaders and the voice of that, right? And so I would say, when you think about the brave space and whose responsibility is it, you really want, as a leader in an organization, to own creating that space and opening up that floor without overly placing some burden on your already burdened and marginalized team members to carry the conversation forward. So I would say be careful of that. A lot of times folks will say, oh, we have a partner of color, that's the person we're gonna kick this to. Now, once folks are getting into that, I'd say we usually ask folks to think about a couple of different things around what the space should look like. We have seen folks who've opted to do affinity groups as opposed to one combined space, and where there is a moment where you have particularly a group of team members that may need to grapple with some deep pain that they're experiencing in the moment, then it can be healthy for them to have their own protected space for that. So we have been, as a team, facilitating affinity groups that might be just for Black staff right now, because folks are wanting to be able to mourn and be vulnerable in a moment where they don't also have to then explain and educate the rest of their team. And we do encourage folks to think about how to allow folks to have clarity on why we're hosting the space, really be explicit and naming what it is that we're here to center and to talk about, right? Whether it is naming George Floyd, whether it is naming racial inequity, whether it is naming, whether it is naming police brutality, which is what most folks are talking about right now. Although I would say I think that dealing with a pandemic is a trauma in and of itself, and so maybe it is naming the trauma of dealing with life amidst the pandemic and what that means. We've seen many folks we have over 100,000 Americans that have died in the last 4 months as a result of it. So that in and of itself may be what needs to be named in that space. So naming why we're here, and then really helping folks to be thoughtful about how do we translate this moment, which is so powerful, into our work and into our actions, right? I think those brave space conversations go best when folks come out of it with a sense of purpose and a sense of control, to be perfectly honest, around I can take the way that I have felt, which may have been very out of control, may have been very vulnerable, and translate that into work that is going to be really purpose-driven. And so I would give advice to folks who are thinking about that, to kind of back to what Rhonda said earlier, think about what is within your willingness to do and to engage. And be clear about that when you come into that space, because your team members are going to say, we have tons of ideas about how we can get really intentional about this work, ranging from a whole new bucket of funding work, ranging from getting out and protesting in the streets, or saying we want to create a rapid response fund right away. If that's not what you're willing to do, if what you're really saying is actually we can have some more robust conversations about this internally and do some equity training, then be very clear up front going in. This is what the type of commitment that we are able to make right now. And to the extent that you really are not capable of leading those conversations, then yes, do lean into experts. There are all sorts of organizations that are really skilled at facilitating and guiding conversations like that.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Tiffany, I'll give you just one last one real quickly. So you sit on the funding side too. So What would you say to funders? What do you hope they take away, and what do you hope their action steps are coming out of this?
Thanks, Celine. You know, just real briefly, I think that Lesley and Rhonda have shared so much, and we know that when we have listened to folks that are most proximate to the needs that we are all trying to address, that we end up actually doing better work together. So really ask yourself, are you in a position where you can listen? Do you have the capacity to shape your strategies based on the advice that you're hearing from community leaders? And what additional sort of metrics you have to navigate with your family trustees or your board members, and just making sure that you are advocating and pushing as far out as you can within those boundaries and guardrails.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I know we are at the top of the hour. I just want to say a really heartfelt thank you. I know that on the one hand, you know, I'm an amplifier. I help people, you know, to get their work in front of funders, and I love getting to do that. It's also asks you to do more work. And so thank you all for doing that more work to help our funders think differently and hopefully engage more deeply. I really appreciate it. And I encourage all of you on the call, you know, we are always looking for ways to deepen this work. And so I'm looking for ideas and looking for your feedback. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.